Hello, hello, hello. We are live on my YouTube channel and we're doing another open chat. So if you would like to join, the link is in the comments. But right now we got someone in the room, so I'll bring him on stage. Jess, how are
Hi.
you?
Good. It's good to see you.
Welcome back to my channel. You're becoming quite the regular, aren't you?
Yes, I'm a regular in this corner.
Yes. Well, I literally just released our conversation that we had. How many months ago?
I don't know.
Early
Was it like a
last
year
year.
ago? It had to be more than a year ago.
I don't know if more than a year ago, but
10 months ago?
10 months ago, probably around there.
Okay.
But yeah, it's live now, open for the internet to tear apart.
Yeah. I don't remember what I said in that conversation.
Well, neither do I. So we're in the same boat here.
I'll
How
have to
you
watch
doing,
through it,
Jess?
and then I'm doing good. Just finishing up a busy week of work. So I got a few minutes here. I can hang out and chat, and then I got to get back to work.
Yes, and leave me alone, floundering.
Yeah.
What are you working on? More animation
I'm
things?
working on some videos for a pharmaceutical conference, and so they have the big videos that open up the show. I'm working on the last of 6 videos that I've been working on, so I'm kind of at the tail end, and the conference is next week. So like, they wish they had this video done several days ago, but people get scripts to me late and all that stuff.
Yes, it's a complicated process. People think it goes faster, and then it's like, well,
Oh yeah.
you have to give me the things so I can
Mm-hmm.
do the things.
Yeah, and there'll be changes this weekend, and it'll be a whole ordeal. So it'll be fun.
Well, good luck with it.
Thanks.
What can we talk about to get your mind
I don't
off
know.
of the stress of work?
Well, I was just like Paul's. Let me see. Yeah, Paul's channel still is going. But they were talking about the fall, and who was it? It was his name's Joe. Posed the question, was the fall bad? And it's an interesting question to ask. And then he was then he was asking also about, what did Eve see when she saw the fruit, and did she actually see that it was good or not? And I put in the chat, like, we always end up talking about ethics of beauty, but
No one should talk about anything else. It's the
that's
most
all we talk
important work of literature in the last 1,000 years.
but Dr. Timothy Patistas says that which is an interesting story, that Adam and Eve see Christ crucified in the garden, and that's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it's interesting. Like, well, I've even got, where is it? There's Peugeot's image of everything, and it's got like, it's the Garden of Eden, but at the top is Christ on the cross, but it's actually the tree of life also. And so there's and I guess it's in other icons too, of Christ being crucified on the tree in the garden. And so Timothy Batista says that that was like Satan's temptation, was to shatter their innocence, because Adam and Eve are innocent. They walk with God in the cool of the day, and they talk with him, and they're in the garden. They're in a paradise, and then and it's trying to figure out, well, then Satan shows them, like, this image of Christ crucified, the Lord who they were walking with and talking with in the cool of the day. Now they see crucified. And like, when I was reading that story, like, it's just such an uncanny sort of like horror movie vibe, because you're like, I'm in the garden, and then you turn this corner and you see this image of just suffering, and you're like, what is going on? Like, it's so uncanny. And then you can imagine, like, you know how it is when you're a kid and you see like a scary image for the first time or something, or some image strikes you.
Right. And it just melded to your brain forever.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden you have, like, you think there's a guy in the closet, he's going to come out with a hook and kill you or something, whatever it is. But part of that, and then how does that tie into like knowledge of good and evil? But I think it has something to do with, in part, with they don't know if they can trust God or not. They don't know if God is good or evil. And so they have to start making judgments about what is good and what is evil. The same thing happens when you're a kid and growing up, and for like myself, like it was a smooth transition into adulthood mostly. There's always stuff, but some people have like a traumatic experience that basically kicks them into real life, and they have to figure it out. And so it's interesting thinking about it in terms of that.
And so is his idea about like seeing Jesus on the cross in the tree, is that something he's claiming is from the church, or is it sort of his?
I think he said in the
he
book
imagines.
It was like something that he imagined. But I know in icons and stuff, there's images of Christ on the tree of life.
Yeah. No, I mean it makes some sense, right? And this sort of like when you're talking about the symbolism of like the cross is this death instrument, yet we've inverted it, we flipped it for it to then through death brings life, and so that symbolically it makes sense. But I didn't know if his claim was that because sometimes there's a lot of church things that are not necessarily in the Bible or doctrine,
right,
per se, but are held by the church. I didn't know if that was one of them. I had never heard that.
I don't
before.
know.
Yeah. Well, so what is that? What for you is interesting about that image and the way that you live your life?
Well, I think in terms of like trying to judge good and evil, like it's interesting because we have to judge, what's right and wrong to live our lives. And so this is sort of the conundrum where you're like, the Bible even says, do justice, do justly, make laws, like, and so that's part of the thing. And then the other part of it is we can't judge God and what he's doing, and we can't judge his world because we don't have and this is kind of gets into the book of Job where this tragedy happens to Job, and even I was just reading, someone brought to me Jeremiah 12, or told me about Jeremiah 12, and in Jeremiah 12 Jeremiah says, God, I have this complaint against you, that why do the wicked prosper? Why don't you round them up like sheep and slaughter them? This is what Jeremiah is saying. He's like, what gives, God? Why aren't you doing justice on the earth? And God's answer is if you get winded when you're running with man, how are you going to run with horses? That's God's answer. And then God goes into this long speech about how he's handing over his beloved bride Israel to her enemies. And then that ends with like a couple of verses of restoration, being like, even though I'm handing her over, she will be restored one day. And so you get this like you don't get any easy answers because God's not pulling any punches. Right. He's like, you want to see this? I'll show you. And it's sort of like, when you're like, God, why is the world the way it is? Why is it so terrible? And he's like, I'm doing something.
Right. It's interesting, this idea of like the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. I had such a different perception of it when I was young versus when I got a little bit older and started digging deeper of like, what is this thing? that I've based my life on. What is this thing? And the Bible Project helped me in a lot of ways, but the way that they talk about the tree of good and evil, and I've heard it talked about like this by other theologians as well, but it was sort of the first time I'd heard it. With the tree of knowledge and good and evil, it's not about knowing good and evil. It's about taking good and evil on our own terms
Mm-hmm.
and defining that as we see fit, which I think shifts the way you look at that story so differently. It wasn't about knowing what was good and evil. It's like, that's not the thing that was forbidden to us, but it was that definition of that on our own terms and taking it in our
Mm-hmm.
own terms that became the problem. And I think you see that time and time again, where what is sin generally? It's the pursuit of something good in the wrong way
Mm-hmm.
on our own terms.
Right.
And I don't know, I think that's sort of become interesting too, where it's when it comes to how do I understand what's good? How do I understand what's true? What's beautiful? And that, you know, that recognition of I have to surrender to something bigger than myself,
Mm-hmm.
participate in this path and learn those things outside of my own terms and be
Mm-hmm.
willing to like trust something as I learn the process of understanding the good, the evil, and like how it operates in the world. And I think there is something sort of beautiful about the Christian story in that sense, where it takes this idea of death and it turns it on its head. It's like, well, when we embrace death, it is not the end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And it can lead to life, especially if you're dying to the things that bring more death into the world.
Right.
And yeah, that's been really interesting too, especially as, you know, ethics of beauty, they talk about, well, what is the truly beautiful? How do we recognize that? Because we've got a lot of ideas of what beauty is, and there's a certain part of understanding what beauty is that is a subjective measure where you have to look at it and judge it on your own terms.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, the way we can recognize true beauty is if it not only embraces the cross, but also the resurrection. So these
Mm-hmm.
two sides of this pattern, of this very ancient story that play itself out in the world, that is like the death is not the end.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see if in the garden, that's what they see, right? This person they've been walking with, talking with on this cross, dead.
Yeah.
How is that good?
Yeah.
And that's where it's like, well, it's not the end of the story.
Right. Yeah. So often we're like, well, this is the ending. This is what, you know, like for Jeremiah, why is the wicked prospering? What's going on? And God like has to put it into a bigger perspective. He's like, you don't know what's going on. You're gonna have to trust me, but I'm doing something good.
Mm.
You know, so in Job they use the metaphor of the lions to as a metaphor for the wicked. So they'll be like, Job's friends say, God will one day break the teeth of the lion. They'll shatter his teeth, you know, break the power of the of evil. And you know, and then Job argues against him and is like, what are you talking about? The wicked are prospering. Like how, because the friends basically have a world, they're like, God blesses the righteous and then he punishes the wicked. And Job's whole argument is sort of based on, he's like, no, the wicked, they don't always get punished. What are you talking about?
Right.
And so anyway, they bring up the metaphor of the lion, but it's interesting to compare that with how God talks about the lion, because he brings it up. So he talks about kind of the world itself. Then God talks about the lion, but immediately God then talks about the raven and then the mountain goat. And I was thinking about like what those have to do with each other. But like God's trying to connect them all. He's trying to show a wildly connected world. So God basically says, who feeds the lion? Who feeds the young lions? And the implication is that God's feeding them. And then it goes to the ravens, and like the ravens feed off the kill that the lions made. And then he says, who gives food to the young ravens when they call out for food? And so you're like, okay, so they're getting their food from there. And then he talks about the mountain goats, and you have to be like John and Peugeot symbolic. Like the mountain is the high place where you're meeting with God, and it talks about the mountain goats giving birth on the heights. And so like all these are different people, and like why are the mountain goats? Why are these people up on the heights? Well, because all the lions are down on the plain, and so the mountain goats go up high, and so it's almost implying like you wouldn't have people giving birth on the heights if there weren't any lions, you know. And so like everything's very complicated and interconnected. It's like have you seen the documentary about the wolves in Yellowstone? It's exactly that.
Oh, I feel like a long time ago, because they got rid of all of the wolves, and then all of a sudden there was all of these problems with like overgrazing with the deer because their populations were running.
Yeah, there were certain species of tree that weren't growing anymore. There were areas that used to be like the ecology of different areas in the park completely changed after the wolves left, and then they reintroduced them, and they saw dramatic changes. So like you said, the overgrazing, the deer would eat up all the little saplings of different tree species, and when the wolves came back and the wolves would make a kill, the deer would avoid that area for a long time, so trees would have a chance to get root and come up. And so like these tree species came back, and then because of those tree species came back, beavers came back in the area. And because beavers came back in the area, they dammed up different parts of the rivers, so these meadows ended up getting flooded. And because of that, these other species, like it just cascaded into all these different things that were all really beneficial for the park. And so you're like wolves are bad. You're like, you can't sure, but you can't say that.
Right. Well, it's sort of the arrogance of like, we know what's best for the ecosystem, where it's like, you don't know all of the unintended consequences of what an action like that's going to change. Like I remember around that time, I think I saw that video, there was that conversation of how can we get rid of all mosquitoes? They cause malaria, which causes so many deaths. It would just be better if they were gone. And it's like, we don't know what killing all the mosquitoes will do.
How many animals survive eating mosquitoes?
Right. Yeah.
And then how many animals survive off those animals that survive off mosquitoes? And like,
well, and who's to say what's going to grow in their place? Because something's going to replace them in the animal kingdom, right? To take the spot that they once held. And what unintended consequences is that going to cause?
Right.
And so it's sort of interesting. And I see the same thing happen with, like global warming or different, science measures. Like, how do we be good to the planet? I'm all for being good to the planet. But I think some of those models and the things that we're talking about, we don't fully know the concepts. We can model it out, as best as we can. There's so much about the world that we don't understand. There's so much about the way things interact that I don't know. I just am more cautious as a human being to be like, yeah, let's mess with it.
Right. Yeah, but it gets to a little bit of that question about like the knowledge of good and evil. When you're like, lions are bad, it's obvious. It's evil and it's bad and they should be eliminated. And so you're just like, okay, things aren't that easy. And then if you get
right,
so, and all of it sort of depends on like a worldview of like, God is still at work, God is still creating, God is still doing stuff. And it's not necessarily just because, there's a lot in Christian environment where I grew up, it's like everything fell and now God's trying to fix stuff after the fall. But this, like what I'm talking about is a lot different. It includes the fall, and it doesn't say that the fall is necessarily good, but it's part of what God is doing in his creative act and his creative process of making the world, making people, all that. And you're like, well, does God let bad things happen? And that's kind of the answer, is like, he's at work. And
which to be fair is sometimes a hard pill to swallow, right?
oh
It
yeah,
seems like
it's terrible.
a placation or something sort of like, what? I mean, I
Right.
get, I mean, I remember when I was first going through deconstruction, asking the questions of like, okay, what's this thing that I believe and why? And like wrestling with the Bible and having to wrestle with these passages
Mhm.
in like the book of Judges, or, you know, wherever there's all these crazy stories in the Bible. Yeah, I remember just struggling with that a little bit and trying to figure out, how do I make sense with this? And I think the more that I dug and the more that I kind of processed it, I realized, oh, there's such a bigger story going on here. And it's
Mhm.
like, in some ways, it's playing with that internalized sense of what is good, what is evil, that sort of thing.
Hey, Bruce.
Hi, Bruce.
Hello, how's it going?
Good. Welcome to the channel. I don't know if I've met you before.
I don't think so.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
Thanks for jumping on the stream.
Yeah, I just saw the link and I had time, so I thought I would jump in.
Yeah, great.
We were just talking about good and evil.
Awesome.
Yeah, tackling the easy questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, did you have any thoughts? Have you been listening to the stream so far, Bruce? Or
Just for about 2 minutes, so it's really hard to chime in. Yeah.
so we can keep going, and then
Yeah.
if you have anything, please jump in, or if there's something you want to talk about, just let me know. I'm happy to talk about whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's like, I mean, and you look at books like Job, right? Like your little pet project, Jess,
Mhm.
and you see the complications of the world laid in those pages. And you read something like Ecclesiastes, and like it opens that picture of like, hey, the Bible's not this sort of squeaky moral code deliverer.
Yeah.
It's something
Right.
more complicated. And I think it's hard as modern people to navigate that, especially when you're kind of set with the idea that it tells you what's good and what's bad. Which in some ways
Yeah.
it does, but not quite in the most direct way.
Well, it's interesting because like the book of Job is perfect for this, because Job's friends are the ones that are trying to placate God and trying to like be like, God can't do wrong. Like, what are you saying? Like, he's obviously executing judgment against you. He's obviously trying to correct you, and they'll say stuff that's perfectly orthodox, which would be, they say, Job, if you would only repent, God is gracious and forgiving. He'll restore you. He's giving you time. You just need to repent. But this would mean that basically Job has to lie in order to fall back into their narrative, and he's not going to do it. He's like, I didn't do anything wrong. And Job's ultimately right. And Job brings a case against God, and Bruce is already cringing.
Yeah.
Job brings a case against God and is like, God, he's like, I want an answer, because, and he lays out all, he does like a negative confession. It's all very, Job has this like clarity about his own innocence, his own integrity, and he wants God to answer him. But even then, Job's like, I will defend my case, but he also says at the end, he's like, I want an indictment. I want God to bring official charges against me. I want to know what I did wrong. And so everything's sort of framed in this justice framework.
Right.
And so Job's complaining the whole time. He's lamenting. He's bringing a case against God. He's like desiring someone to mediate between him and God, because he's like, how am I supposed to talk to God or whatever? But ultimately, God says that Job spoke what was right, and the friends didn't. And even in that Jeremiah 12 passage that we were just talking about, where Jeremiah is like, I'm going to complain to you, God, about how you're not acting justly. And so there's this weird, and God seems to approve of that, that we should demand some kind of justice, but also there's more stuff going on. And so it's not just like, just trust God and have faith. You don't understand. It's like, if you have something to complain about, you can like go to God. And this is like, Job is the model, because like he refuses to accept any answers except he wants God to speak to him. And so like, that's like, if you really have something that you're suffering with or whatever, like you need an answer from God, really. Like that's the only thing that could satisfy you, and to accept sort of, this is where the religious ends, and you have to have an actual encounter with God about this thing, and you can't just hide in your religious tradition. There's an end. There's a point where it kind of like doesn't give you the answers, and you actually need an encounter with God. And this is what Job's friends kind of don't do. They don't talk to God. Job talks to God. His friends talk about God, and they talk about what's right and what's whatever. And they moralize and they pass judgment. And not Job definitely moralizes and passes judgment too, but he's he's going somewhere, man. And like, it's somewhere different than.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting story, right? And I think it breaks the categories of what we sort of want to recognize as humans.
Yeah, so often we think that God just wants us to obey. And it's true that we need to obey. But it's also like if you have something, like we have to have this encounter, we have to meet. So often people will hide those things in their heart, and they won't actually express it to God, because they're ultimately afraid of him. And there's plenty to be afraid about, but because like God's speech at the end of Job is terrifying, but it's also the thing that comforts Job too. So it's this sense of awe and terror and comfort and worship all at the same time. Like, so it's not just like happy puppy dog God at all. It's the God of creation, but yet he meets with Job face to face. He comes and speaks with him. And really, like, that's what will sort of quell our deepest problems with God, because like we were talking about, like, we have to judge, we have to like choose between good and evil, we have to obey, we have to we have laws and morals and ethics and all this stuff, but and to hold those to God is not to be like, God, why aren't you doing these things towards me? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I read the book of Job, and I'm struck by a couple of things, because I mean, there's several times in the Old Testament where God talks about what he likes more than something, right? Like, the first one I remember reading is, I prefer obedience to sacrifice. But then the second is, I prefer mercy to sacrifice. And I think sometimes in the Western frame of Christianity, it's very much put around sacrifice and how we can die to ourselves and what we can give for the pursuit of Christ. And sometimes that's necessary in the process and following God, but there is something more than just that sacrifice that is wanted. where it's like obedience and mercy and understanding mercy and sort of the Orthodox frame of like healing.
Right.
It's kind of that beautiful, that beautiful story of like, hey, maybe by this obedience, it's leading me to some way of healing, to some path of healing. And that's ultimately what God wants more than me just sacrificing everything in my life to pursue him. But the second thing I think often is like, I remember the times where I felt like I had that moment where everything was stripped away from me, where I was in that painful process of like dealing with the fact of losing something that I didn't want to lose, or dealing with a sickness I didn't want to deal with. And it's like, when you get to the end of that, there's this weird sort of acknowledgement of like, I don't think I know what blessing is to begin with. Because sometimes, like in that pain, you're blessed with things that you never could have had if you hadn't gone through that process of like suffering.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that's how I feel like Job comes to at the end, where like there's still that sort of like angstiness and like, I don't know why I'm suffering, and then has this encounter with God and like, I don't know, this peace and this recognition of like, I don't understand anything. Like a terrifying place to be, but also kind of a wonderful place to be, where you're like,
Yeah, it's both those things at the same time, I think. And it's interesting because like so many things are happening to Job at the end there, but you know, I was just re-listening to my conversation with Paul about the U-shaped journey, but that was what that whole conversation was about. It's like those times when you suffer and you go through hard things, that's what makes you. and so like it's not an easy answer where you're just like, well, I guess suffering's okay then. No, suffering is terrible, but you can't divorce it from this. It's also what is making you as well.
right. It's like, I look through some of the bad things that I went through, and it's like, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, but I also wouldn't wish it never happened to me. And it's that weird dichotomy of like,
well, and then another thing with Job is that kind of what he was wishing for. So, and this happens progressively through the conversation. At first he says, there's no arbiter between me and God, so it's impossible. There's no mediator between me and God. This is impossible. And then a little later on, he says, like, I wish I had a mediator. And then a little later on, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives. Like, I have a mediator in heaven. And so this idea of the mediator is, like, you can see it going from sort of weak, saying there is no mediator, to I know my Redeemer lives. There is a mediator. It goes from weak to strong in him. So it's like this idea of the mediator is building up in him. And then in the end, he offers the prayer and does the sacrifice for the friends. So he actually becomes the mediator, the thing that he wished he had. And so often this is what happens. Like we'll suffer something, and a lot of people will then help others that suffer with the same thing. So like Chad the alcoholic, like that's what he does. He helps other people that struggle with alcoholism. And he even talks about it, like we were just talking about. He's like, I'm thankful for my alcoholism because it brought me to where I am. I wouldn't be here without struggling with alcoholism. He's like, I don't want to take another drink in my life, and then he's always helping people with that. And so, yeah, it's interesting because, you know, you wish there was someone to help you. And then when you finally make it through the other side, you're there to be the helping hand for people that need a mediator.
Yeah. I don't know, Bruce, do you have any thoughts about all of this?
I don't know where to start. Far too often, I think people find themselves reading books like Job and calling themselves Job. We're not Job. in the same way that we're not David or Goliath, right? These stories are descriptive, not prescriptive necessarily. Sometimes they're prescriptive, but I would say that it's very easy to take descriptive passages in the Old Testament and then some in the New, apply that to yourself, put yourself as this individual, and then attempt to fit that into your current frame or current structure. You know, in the case of Job, the thing that's the most interesting to me that I think really comes into play is even the most righteous man on the planet is worthy of God's wrath because of our flesh and our sin. So that being true, the reliance on God for all that we have is made more apparent and more evident. And so I find Job to be comforting in that respect. It is fearful, I think, but I think it's supposed to be. And the story of Job puts my life into perspective. And the perspective is I am the creature. And I am wholly grateful that the Lord has used me as a means by which he decides to bring others to Christ in the world, or to spread the truth of his gospel, or to use me in whatever way that he pleases. The fact that he's humbly using me as a means by which he has decreed is very hard to reconcile, considering the chasm. So it's some people, I think, would do a naturalistic approach to this and say, I'm on a tiny rock in the middle of the universe, and there's, you know, I can't believe that my life has any significance at all. And I would state that I can't believe that my life has any significance at all because God had felt the need for his own good purposes to make me and use me for what he will. And that kind of obedience is the obedience that I hope to maintain, and I know is possible but difficult by way of the Holy Spirit that would happen. But you know, that's the perspective I've had as I've gotten older. When I was younger, I was much more arrogant about that issue. It's sort of a works-based idea of quid pro quo, as opposed to submission. And I find that to be a good part of that story. And even those brothers of Job who had some of the right words maybe were not oriented correctly in their faith. You know, Abraham is as tasked to find righteous men, and the Lord knows he can't find them. But there are people that Abraham thought were righteous, maybe, that he could maybe find. And not in the eyes of God were they righteous, you know. So the judgment is ultimately in the eyes of the Lord. But that's kind of how I would wrap all that up. I'm just sort of adding to the discussion on Job.
Yeah, well, and so how do you think that shift in the way that you've seen Job as you've gotten older, as you've processed through that, has it changed the way that you live? Does it change the way that you participate every day?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I never wanted children when I was younger. I now have 4. I never wanted to get married. I'm married. You know, I never thought I would be an elder in a church. You know, following the Lord in obedience is very difficult. And sometimes you're wrong, sometimes you're right. But understanding that you have, like, the prayer, the Lord's Prayer, and asking God for his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's a bold prayer. It was once under, you know, I thought, and probably with poor teaching, but I sort of thought that was a declarative to proselytize so that people might come to faith. And now I see it as giving people a message of mercy. And so working out all things for his good purpose, how I would I would work in the world is according to God's will, not my own. So that's really how things have changed as far as I've gotten older. And I think sanctification does that to a man and a woman, or however you want to see it. And some people have a harder time with that at younger ages or older ages. And there are people younger than I that have worked this out earlier. Good parents in teaching. And there are people older than I that still have scales on their eyes. And it's really hard to see that.
Yeah.
But eventually, I think people will be rightly reconciled, whether it's justice or not. For in their eyes, it is in God's eyes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested. What is your background with faith and religion? Did you grow up with it, or is it something that you came to as you got older?
I never once would ever have called myself an atheist. In fact, I probably had always said there's a God. I'd always probably would have even admitted that Jesus was real. I was baptized at 19, although technically I was christened as a baby in the Catholic Church by nominal parents. My parents were not people that raised me in the church per se, although my father, when he remarried, and it's like, hi Grim, he would take me to church, or I would go and play and sing and stuff like that. But yeah, I grew up just cultural Christianity, conservative parents, but they never went to church or anything. I got baptized in college, and at that point, my life was changed. I was a musician. I still am a musician. I work in churches. Now I'm a Reformed Baptist confessing Calvinist at a church where I am also an elder. And those are my convictions. I don't find them to be required for people, but those are my convictions. So I've kind of grown up into that. I didn't grow up in the Reformed tradition or anything like that. In fact, I would imagine much of my grandparents, and they're dead now, but they probably would be not a fan of the Protestant grandchild that they have, because they have a cultural Catholicity about their Italian heritage. So, but for me, I would be, they probably see me as, they would call me, I've heard them say this when I was younger, that would be like a born again holy roller. That's what they would call me, compared to them. But it's funny because my grandmother read the Scofield Reference Bible as a Catholic. So all very strange hodgepodge of things, My wife and I kind of grew up together in the faith, as in a way, like we both, we met each other 18. I would confess at 19 and became baptized. She was rebaptized later in her life because she was baptized in the Presbyterian Church as when she'd never made a confession of faith. And so for her convictions and ours, we're both Baptists, and she said, well, I'd never made a confession. I want to confess and be baptized. And so she was later in our lives, in our marriage. And we had no problem with that, and nobody had a problem with that. It's a confession of faith and symbolism of immersion. So a sign of the covenant for people to see. And so we're in that camp, and we've been in that camp for a long time. I think also having kids and them, raising them and looking at how do I give my children framework around the beliefs that I hold, and then how do we give them, account for the hope that is within me. And so we're discipling our children in the same way that we disciple strangers. Some people don't see it that way, but I do. I believe that we are teaching our children and growing them. And I have faith that God will indeed redeem my children. But even if He doesn't, that is my role as parent. So that's kind of why theology and like people, you're going to go in the world and people are going to ask you, why do you believe this? Or I don't believe you. Or why are you even at church? These questions are going to come up. Now you could ignore them, I suppose. But I never felt like I could ignore them. And I want the same for my children. And I at least want to give them, a theological framework for what we believe, why we believe it, being convicted as a Protestant and not merely a Protestant out of tradition. And if they want to explore that when they get older, they will. But I don't want them to take it on my word. I want them to take it on God's word. So, many Protestants are not Protestants of conviction, and I find that to be a massive issue today. So that's kind of been my bend for the past decade, I guess. I'm 36 now. I'll be 36 next month. or March. It's not February yet. You know, so that, yeah, anyway, that's a nutshell. I know I'm talking forever.
Oh no, it's fine. I mean, what your parents being sort of nominally Catholic when you started moving towards a more religious lifestyle, was that weird for them? Was it weird for them to see you be Protestant as well?
No, my father was totally, he's a nominalist, been a nominalist for a while. He's disabled now, so life is difficult, but when he remarried, his wife was a Methodist, you know, but my mother was largely agnostic to the idea. It's kind of weird. I moved out of the house, and really in my world was like, I was independent at that point. Like 18 years old, that's me. I'm on my own. I'm not at home anymore. You know, my brother, funny enough, like my brother and I separated at 15 years old. I went to move with my father. It's kind of a long story, but my brother also came to faith in middle school. I've never really talked to him anymore. He and I are close friends now, but about a very similar time in our lives, but different directions, different faith denominations, everything pushed us both into Christianity. And my mother resisted my brother at the time, but as far as I was concerned, she didn't see an issue. Today, my mother is much more open to the idea. She's not as hostile.
Yeah.
She used to, be pretty blunt about science or whatever, but
Sure.
now I think part of the issue is she sees the fruit in it with our children. She has grandchildren. I think a lot of that changes her perspective. But they weren't, in fact, my father encourages it. He's never been like hey, that's weird. No. And that's part of the issue is my family, as far as the Catholic side, never really had held convictions. Like, for instance, my uncle married a Jewish lady, and their daughter they put into Catholic school, and their son they raised in Hebrew school. They had like this split household. Now he's since divorced, but I have Jewish cousins now. So they were never really, for them it was cultural Christianity. They never really had any convictions on that.
Yeah. No, I just find it so interesting the dynamics of family within all of those things. Like I grew up Protestant, and so but neither of my parents were really, their families weren't that religious. My one grandma was more like spiritual, not religious, and then my mom's family, they like went to church sometimes, but it wouldn't be what you consider a traditional, family. And so seeing them move into that was interesting. And then I recently converted to Orthodoxy. So that was interesting in that change of going into a more traditional view of Christianity. So I'm always interested in people's perspective with the family and the struggles that come with that, because I think it often has a way of shaping and like giving us trust in that path of like walking through and trying to understand what's real with those things.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I meet with Orthodox believers weekly. I think I had 5 of them last night here, like 6 of them last week. We meet together on a lot.
Yeah.
And they think they think I'm silly, but it's also pretty good. It's the Orthodox movement has been interesting. I have lots of thoughts around why it's blowing up, but maybe that's for a different day.
Yeah, either way. I mean, does anybody else have any comments? Grizz, I know you came in. Hi, Richard, just came in.
Yeah, I wanted to complain about Job. Honestly.
The person or the book?
Yes.
Yes.
Like, propositionally, the book of Job lands to me like this is your it's like me and my cat. Like, whatever I do to my cat, it's like maybe it could run away. We don't even get that option. We're born into this like completely like love me or I'll send you to hell. And even the guy who does the best at loving me, watch what I do to him. So it's like I don't know how to get from like do it or else to genuine love of the Lord. And I don't know how that's supposed to work. That's
so how much stock do you put in the ending of Job? Like the very end, where like
God's speech
no, like the fact that God like
restores him.
quadruples, yeah,
Restores
him
his
and-
dead wife. Yeah,
His wife never
Yeah.
dies.
I thought he took away his
His
wife and his
kids.
family and his
All
land
his
and
children
everything.
died.
His kids died. Yeah, all his kids died. So that's
His wife
like
made
the
it. I didn't
only-
realize. I thought he got a new wife too.
She tells him to curse God and die in
Yeah,
chapter
that's right.
2.
Yeah.
She's
What if it was only that easy, and if death was the end of it?
well, yeah. I mean,
Maybe back in the Old Testament, if you did that, he'd kill you. But
well,
No,
in their time, like you went to the land of Sheol. Like
Yeah.
it was this shadowy place where you go when you die. Like who knows what goes on there. But even like in Job, it's interesting because he'll talk about he was like, I used to be this tree, and now I've been chopped down all the way to the ground. There's nothing left in me. And then he has this thought. He's like, but even trees, like when they're chopped down, a little sprout can start coming up and it can grow again. And then he has another thought. He's like, maybe when I'm in Sheol, God will remember me because I used to be great. And maybe he'll remember me and bring me back. And so he kind of has these inklings of like, this doesn't have to be over. There's signs that something else could happen, but he still has the whole problem of like, what are you doing, God? Why are you doing this evil to me? Why are you making, why all this injustice against me? Yeah, I think that's interesting, especially the one where he talks about being in Sheol and having God remember him. Like he still sort of has this notion. He's like, maybe God and I can be on good terms again. He's like, maybe. So he never, and then his friends immediately like crap on this idea. They're like, no, when God chops down the tree, he burns it and destroys it. And it never, like, his friends are completely brutal. He has like this little bit of hope, and they're like, you don't understand the Lord. He's going to destroy everything. And
I mean, they're not necessarily wrong to think that. Right.
and what a mercy that would be compared to this.
In some ways, it might
Well-
be a mercy, right?
that's Job's argument at the very beginning in chapter 3. He laments. He's like, why was I even born? What was the whole point of this? And then he says, why are you keeping me alive, God? What is the reason?
Yeah.
Like there's no, just kill me and get it over with. Like just bring death to me.
No, in the same way, why doesn't God kill Satan immediately either?
Just the same reason he put him in the garden.
It's
Or
for his own good
took him in the
purposes,
garden.
right? Like for his own good purposes. There's so much glory to be held in all of these
Well-
stories that it's so hard to understand.
I mean, to
That-
put it,
It brings me back to the fall you were talking about earlier, right? About the good and evil thing and how it's hard for us to know. If God put the serpent and the tree in there, presumably omniscient enough to know how it was going to play out, right?
Hmm.
Then is that not sort of a directive for us to obtain the knowledge of good and evil?
It's hard to say, right? That's an interesting point. The why question there is really tough to answer.
Well, so I mean, I realized recently that I think it's significant that in Revelation you don't get a reversion back into naive knowledge. Because like, if God took away the knowledge in the end, it would seem he did want us to eat it and obtain the knowledge. Like,
yeah,
it's
and
almost-
Peugeot even talks about. Oh,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, Peugeot talks about that it was premature, that eventually God
Yeah.
would have given us the fruit. at some point, but we took it to, like, we weren't ready for it, and it's sort of like a shattering of innocence. And if you're not ready for something, it's a trauma, rather than something that you can integrate. So we couldn't integrate it, and then we fall apart. And so but you're still left with the same question: is like, what is God up? What is God doing? Like,
well,
with all
and
of it.
you also have the tension between our will and the God's will as
Yep.
well, because it's like, because I would want to say that I would agree with Peugeot that it was premature, but then I would also want to say that God willed the premature consumption for some reason. Right? Like, it was better for us to prematurely eat, in some sense, for some reason that I could speculate on, but perhaps not, may or may not be able
Maybe
to
it was the
know.
perfect time. Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, like we were talking about
Yeah,
earlier,
I
Jess, it's a lot about this defining it on our own terms, right? And it seems like that's what happened in the garden of we're going to decide how we find good and evil on our own terms. I mean, and there's
Yeah.
there's certainly a lot to learn from that.
I would
Even
think
if it does
yeah.
come with pain.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest truisms is that man has a knowledge of good and evil from birth. They understand right and wrong in a way, in a certain sense, and that's hard to reconcile because there's so much perversion that happens where the good and evil start to blur in our minds. But there still is there's a right and wrong, a sense of justice, mercy, hope. These things exist for all of man from birth. Definitionally, it's difficult, but
I would call it a sense, but I wouldn't call it a knowledge.
well, however you want to see that propositional knowledge,
I think it's in the distinction there is important because like the tree granted the knowledge, and we could have always had the sense.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
like,
that's fair.
Oh yeah.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
and like for them to know, like I can see something and know it's evil, but until I understand the motive or what the evil, like the motive of the evil, until I know why I might do the evil,
Sure.
like see the appeal of it, just like, oh, that's evil, I reject it. I don't have no knowledge. I think you have to understand the temptation to do evil, and that's the form of knowledge that we're gaining. Like, and we're instructed by that soul. Like if my heart hurts because I see a thing, then that's a soul sense to me. Like even in our scientific realm, the way we understand emotions, it's so vaguest to me to like that's probably just the soul, and that's why science doesn't talk about emotions much. So, but yeah, that's just the knowledge part.
I think there's different types of knowing too.
Yeah.
Four. It's perfect.
There's 5. There's ritual knowing now.
But I mean, like, without getting into the Vervaekian terms, like, I think there's a difference between having an instinct of feeling like something's wrong versus the instinct of knowing something is wrong versus the instinct of doing that thing and feeling the consequences of it and understanding why it's wrong. Right? And so there's all of these processes and there's these different ways of how we can know those things, whether we participate in it ourselves or we watch other people participate in it. There's a lot of like patterns going on that point us to this different type of knowing, because I think our instincts are corruptible. Like often they're cueing us to something true, but depending on what we're putting in our brains, how we're raised, the things we've experienced, those instincts, I think, can be misinterpreted and corrupted by us. And there's like a deeper pattern of like knowing that we are all playing into in different ways and like trying to figure out as we live in this crazy world.
Yeah, I think there's something that's experienced that puts the knowledge into a proper orientation or a bad orientation, but the experience is still shaped by the is still shaped by the processes that you have from birth. So in other words, when you experience something and you gain better knowledge, or rather understanding from the experience, it's still shaped by the knowledge that you have before that. So I don't believe this tabula rasa blank slate idea. I think that's kind of wacky. So even in a position where you're wholly innocent, according to the world standards, you're still operating with some sense before you act, and so you're getting informed by that, but it doesn't somehow give you a newness of knowledge outside of the experience you have before that as well. It's very difficult to explain, but there's and I also don't think there's a way of getting away from propositions. I think propositions are difficult and they muddy the water sometimes because language is hard, but that's how we communicate. There are ways we communicate that aren't propositional, but they're internalized and then measured against something. So there's a proposition right there every time you act. Now you can try and reorient that, but you're going to have some propositional understanding whenever you engage in something. And it's always
Right.
It's easy to do things like with you and another person. When the third party shows up, now the propositions are even more required, because you have another party that is bringing forth their experience, and explaining yourself in some way or even acting in a certain way requires sort of a propositional truth claim in some way. Now it's very different for lots of people, but I do think that there's a natural piece to that.
Yeah.
What other problems do you have, Graham?
Jess is ready for them.
It's like, okay, so theoretically, if I'm all obedient, I'll eventually learn to love that way. Because, like, propositionally, the situation requires for bitterness. I created you to do my bidding, and if you don't, I'll send you to hell. Like, propositionally, that's like, why am I supposed to love that guy? And so, like, theoretically, through obedience, what? Like, he's so nice to me, I come to love him? And isn't that selfish? And I don't know. It's just the same problem. I don't know where to go with that.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what I think the book of Job is trying to put on its head, because you have Job who's perfectly obedient in every way, even and he's truly obedient in his heart, and he loves God. And so you have the image of basically the complete man. I won't say perfect, because I know that triggers some people. So he's as good as a human being can be. Here's Job. He's a shining light of what it is to be godly, and he's not even Jewish. He's a Gentile, and he has a relationship with God that's real. And the accusation against him is that, how do you know it's real? He's getting blessed, and this is the, so you don't know something, so then there's this doubt, and people, you can psychologize this. So like William Blake does this. He's like, that doubt is in Job's mind, and because right now his relationship with God is one of reciprocity. Like, I obey, God blesses, this kind of thing. And there's a lot of things in life like that. If you obey farming techniques, you get a field full of crops. If you don't, and you sin in your farming, your crops fail. But the question is like, what happens if you do all the farming techniques right and then your crops fail? There's a disaster. Like, then what? So anyway, but that's the whole setup is you actually have a setup where there's a righteous man who is then God, it has to be made known that he's actually really good, because I think there's a deep point that God's trying to make is that men, that he's not stupid for believing in men, kind of thing. Because everyone denigrates men in the book of Job, the friends, Satan, except for Job and God. Job stands up for his own integrity because he's like, I know at least I'm innocent and I didn't do anything to deserve this. He doesn't claim he's sinless. He says, I have sins of my youth, but that in no way explains what's happened. And the friends, Elihu has this dream. It's in chapter 4. It's right at the beginning of the book. Job laments. Then Elihu says this dream, and this dream is about this spirit. It comes into the room, glides over him, and then whispers in his ear and says, there is no one righteous. There is no one righteous. And this is Elihu's worldview. He's like, everyone's corrupted and man is no good. So let's get with the repenting Job. Let's see what God may restore you. He is gracious and forgiving, and Job will have none of it.
Well, it seems, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to pull it out sort of bigger outside of just Job. It seems like the character of God is not just one that wants you to obey the things that he says. There seems to be some sort of this relational aspect in the process of how he works, where he set apart the Israelite people. They went into a covenant together and they had this participation, and there was a different sort of expectation or ask for obedience for them versus any of the other peoples in the world. Why? Well, there's a lot of questions, but there seems to be something where it's not just about God wanting to have that you must obey me sort of rule. And I look at like myself being a Christian, I can see on the outside why there would be this tension. Yet being a Christian who was drawn to this story, found the beauty in the story, and couldn't help but believe it, the things that I choose to do to be obedient to the faith doesn't feel like I'm doing it to win anything. It really does feel like there's this participation and this trust in something bigger of like, if God is asking me to do it, there must be something healing to it. There must be something it's trying to teach me. And I think of it like in the relation of a good father, right? Is it wrong? Is it wrong to leave your house after 10 p.m.? Well, not inherently, but what if my dad says, hey, I'm underage, no more going out after 10 p.m.? Well, then there becomes this obedience thing where it's like, well, he's asked me to do that for my protection. Most likely, like if he's a good father, it usually is. But there's that recognition, am I going to obey him or not? And, me not obeying him doesn't change the love factor, but it certainly will change probably the consequences I receive from not listening to that pattern. And the more that I don't listen to that, the more it's going to be harder. But there's some of that process of that, of like, why do I listen to my dad when he says, come home at 10 p.m.? Because I trust him. And even if I feel like it's unfair, I recognize there's a safety factor of what he's trying to do. And I can hold on to that. But it gets, it's far more complicated than that. I think that's too simplistic in the whole sense. But I think that's one of the questions.
You said it didn't complicate the love factor. And it makes me wonder if, like, for the people that God doesn't plan on sending to hell, if that's like something they already have inside them, or if like if people never just like have any love for him, is it because they weren't the elect? Because like several branches of Christianity think most of us are going to hell. So
sure,
that's an interesting aspect though. It's like, for either of you, and Richard, if he comes back, was the love of God and or life something that was inborn in you, or did you come to it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there was something in me. I grew up in a Christian household, right? So you can say that maybe that influenced the way that I saw God. But either way, I always believed in God. and had some sort of like fondness to that idea. But I think the love part of it, of like falling in love with God and the path of religion, happened in waves. Like I think when I was 18 and realized, oh wait, I'm responsible for my own choices, and my parents' proclivity to a faith does not make it therefore mine, and does not make it me participate well with it. There's something called upon me. And walking that path made me, I think, really fall in love with the idea of God and the participation. But then, you know, there was moments where that got shook and the cracks started forming. And I thought, well, is this thing I committed to my life to good? Is it true? Is it the thing I should be committing my life to? And I never lost love from that, but there was that tension, that sort of pulling apart, right? And you have to wrestle through those questions. But similar to the ones that you're asking, of like, why would a good God cause so many atrocities? Why would a good God do all of these things that are in the Bible? Why would a good God do all of these things? And yeah, I don't think it made me lose love, but it certainly made me dig deeper to understanding the complexity, not only of humanity, but like the idea of the divinity and what that is. And I mean, the hell question's an interesting one. I never believed because of hell, right? I never believed because I didn't want to go to hell. In fact, I found sometimes a little bit of like an uncertainty of if that's what you're doing, just escaping punishment. Is it the purest sense of what it is to like pursue God, even though it's very understandable? Like if it's, you know, obey God or eternal conscious torment. Well, that's a difficult choice, I suppose. But I don't know. There is something to think about that, and there are a lot of different perceptions of what hell is and what God is, and I think wrestling with those has been an interesting process. And I don't have a hard stance on what I think the afterlife is, because I think it's too complicated to be so assured. But the more that I look at it, the more I do at least have a hope that some sort of universalism is true. Because it seems to me in God's character to want everyone to be saved. Whether that's the truth or not, that's beyond my pay grade to give you a definitive answer, but there is that hope. I think it is something I could see in God's character. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my answer.
Well, you grew up witnessing it. So that was your first draft, was people love God.
Well, and that was something interesting. A while back, I got asked the question, what's your biggest evidence for God? And like, that's a very difficult one because there's so many complexities that come in that. But when I really thought about it, the biggest impact in like the spiritual path and the thing that impacted me the most is the way that it impacts others. I saw the way that choosing a life to follow God drastically impacted the lives of my parents in this way that was very different than the people around them that weren't. And when I chose to walk that path myself, it drastically impacted and transformed my life in a way that I had never seen before and that I had to wrestle with, even when I was wrestling with the propositional parts of those things. And, you know, it continues as I move into orthodoxy and continue to try to expand this idea of what is Christianity and what does it mean to have right practice, right belief, and all of those things. I think there's something so powerful about the way ideologies and practices show in people's lives and transform them into different beings. And for me, that's really powerful.
What about you, Jess? Did you love God always, or did you have to learn to? Is it something you had inside you that woke up, or?
My parents weren't Christians when I was born. They became Christians when I was about 8. So I essentially was raised in my conscious life as a Christian. I remember, I think I've always loved God. I've always had that sense. But like Cassie was saying, like it's my image of him has changed. So like, for example, I was wanting to be a Christian missionary my parents were missionaries at the time, like as I was graduating high school. And so I was doing missions work, which I saw as like, you know, Peterson saying like, go and do the best thing you could possibly think of, the highest good. And so that's what is before Peterson, of course. So that's what I was aiming at. I was like, I'm going to do the best thing I possibly can, but it was very frustrating. I couldn't, because I'd have to raise my own support. I wasn't really finding a place. I was, you know, I was definitely making friends and having good. It was never like a terrible experience. It was just like, it wasn't working at some level. And I was also in my early 20s. And so like, I'm asking questions like, what am I going to do with my life? And for me, like, this is the example I was trying to get to, is that, like I wanted God to just tell me what to do. I was like, just tell me what you want me to do. I've been told like God has a plan for your life. God has all this work that he wants people to do. He has these missions for you, all this stuff. And so I got extremely frustrated one day, and I was like, just sort of praying to God, and I was angry at him and complaining. And I was like, just tell me what to do. Like, why is this so hard? Like, what? And I'll just do it, and I won't complain. I won't. And he refused. Instead, he asked me what I wanted to do. And I'm getting choked up because it's still
Audibly?
just in my heart.
Like
I just heard him say, "What would you like to do?" And I immediately knew, and it wasn't missions. So I just told him, and again, like, heard in my heart, he's like, "Then go do that." I was like, "Okay." So I went off to college. I went and studied audio engineering, and it was a complete failure. And spent a couple of years trying to, like, it was a little like I just went out. Like it was it really was kind of just like the call to adventure, and I just went out into the world. And I had, so shortly after this, I was in Colorado after that prayer time. So I had applied to the school, I had got accepted, and so I was going to Arizona to go to school, and I was mountain biking. And I remember I stopped because I was winded, and I was looking out over the mountains over Colorado Springs, and I was like, I had this feeling like that things weren't going to be the same. And I was like
like when you left for Arizona, or
when I was leaving missions, I was leaving, like I was sort of stepping out into the bigger world, and it was an existential, like, things are not going to be the same. And really, like, I'm in my early 20s. I'm like, becoming a man. And so, like, becoming independent. And I just said to God, I was like, "You're letting me go, aren't you?" And again, in my heart, I heard him say, "Yeah, but you'll know me better."
Yeah, he likes the prodigals, man. That's the deal.
Well, that's the thing, is like, I never went through a rebellious phase. I never I didn't sleep around or do drugs or drink or whatever. Like, I never did any of that. And like, so, so much of my story is like backwards, because God called me out of missions work to the world. And I didn't let him go. He let me go. And then similar to Cassidy. Like I had like a whole like deconstruction experience, trying to deal with the propositions and the weird stuff that comes with evangelical Christianity and all that. But and many times I was like, am I an atheist? Do I come out as an atheist or whatever? Because I don't even know. And I was like, I can't. And so back to your original question, it was just like, I always just had the sense that, like, if I let go of everything, all the propositions, all the religion, whatever caught me was God.
Yeah, it was like love was this powerful thing that like grounded
Yeah.
me in something bigger, right? Like the love for the religion, the experience that I had with that, the recognition of the positivity that it gave me, like even through all the questions, it grounded me. And I got to the point where it's like, if the propositions don't line up and atheism lines up in my favor, like I have to reject this thing. It wasn't it wasn't that thing where it was like, well, even if I find it to be totally wrong, I'm not going to reject it because of this. It's like, no, I have to put that aside and not say I reject it. But I'm grateful it never got that far.
Yeah.
Because I think if it did, then where do I put this thing? It would to me,
You'd
it
still
was
be in
like,
the same position, kind of. You'd still be conflicted.
well, it would feel more like a delusion or something
Mhm.
not true, and like I wrestled a long time with atheism, more than I think I would if I didn't come from a Christian background, because I didn't want to give in to the confirmation bias of like, yeah, I wanted religion to be true because it gave me so much, but I was not willing to play that game where I was going to hold it and be fake to
Mhm.
something that wasn't real. But like there was something, I wonder if I didn't have that experience and that warm connection to the faith, even, I've had negative experience in churches, don't get me wrong, but if I had not had that scale switch, would have been easier to just throw everything out and kind of walk away and say, well, I just don't want to even believe any of this. I think so. Like, his love is such a powerful thing. And I think sometimes it can blind us, but I think it also grounds us in ways that are more important. Even when you do have some of the axioms wrong or the propositions wrong, because we all do. Like every single person has something wrong, and whether we know it or not.
Yeah, the plethora of religious approaches to God makes it really easy to just assume all of them are mostly wrong. And that, like, if there is a God, he will get to you the way. I mean, he made you, he knows how to get to you. If he wants to call you, he'll call you. But what do you do when the phone doesn't ring?
Right.
Well, that's funny too, because I think about that a lot. Like I went through this very interesting path, and now I'm Orthodox, and I wonder, why didn't God just like show me that sooner? Why did I have to go through all this path, and why did I have to go through the wrestling and the like breaking myself down to almost nothing? Why did I have to do that? And I think about it, and I go, okay, Cass, if he had shown you any time sooner, would you have been receptive to it? And the answer is probably no.
Yeah, Orthodox. I don't know why so many people are just sliding into it, because I look at just the notion and I'm like, yeah. So
I don't know if I could raise kids in my Orthodox church. Well, I look at, like, there's a family in my parish with, I think, 5 kids. I just wonder what is going through their minds when they're like sitting in this service.
it depends on how good their parents are. Probably, I can't wait to get back to my video games.
I don't know.
You're a little quiet. Can you lean closer, Richard?
Yeah, hold on. Let me try this. Is
No, you got quieter. I think you're still connected to the headphones, maybe? I'm not sure.
Is that better? How's
That's
that?
better, yeah.
Okay, cool. I mean, I don't know. I think because I had this experience of going to like not the Orthodox parish I go to now, but I visited like a big one of like 400, 500 people, and when after like 2 hours, because it's like a 3 hour service, you get communion, and the kids go first, and you get this rush of like 25, 30, 35 kids who just seem so excited to participate. And it was really bizarre, but it seemed genuine to me. And after working with kids, it really did seem genuine. And like, I think your point about how good the parents are is right, because if parents can make their kids recognize that these video games and these TV shows and these things that the culture gives you are ultimately vacuous and that they're not going to sustain you, then I think the kids growing up like imbibe this sense that okay, there is a place for these things, but I know to be I know that I should be excited about this service and this liturgy because this is what's going to sustain me through life.
Mm. Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I got to experience, watching kids in a Protestant frame and an Orthodox frame.
Yeah.
And I honestly think the Orthodox frame is somewhat easier in a certain way, where there's so much respect for children in the Orthodox frame. Like there's a reason they go first to communion. There's a reason they don't separate them from the service. They treat them like they can understand and that they're not lesser. And
Like
there's
Jesus
something
said.
right. And there's something kind of beautiful about that. And there's that I don't know, there's a beauty in Orthodoxy where it's like the minimal participation is standing. And even that, it's sort of there's definitely lenience in that. But there's something about the symbolism of like we stand because there's that hope that our bodies come with us in the next life. And so that's this physical reminder of like we're not just looking for spiritual renewal. We're hoping for that same thing with our bodies as well. And it's very, it's very ritualistic. And so kids get to soak that in and take that in. They have their whole lives to kind of absorb that and ask the questions and be there. And it's interesting. I'm only 4 years into exploring Orthodoxy. I've only been Orthodox a full year, fully. And so there's so much that I don't know. And there's so much of the process, like it's hard, it's difficult. And there's things I feel like I fail all the time. But there is that sort of trust of like, it's a process. You just feel it more in Orthodoxy. It's a process. You don't have to have it all in one go. And I love that embodying children in it, where it's not like you have to dumb it down for them. They get it more than we recognize. And that's, I think that's beautiful because I do think we think children are stupid when they're not. They don't know a lot, but they're not stupid.
I think they're closer to God, and like they haven't fallen as much. If the fall is self-consciousness, then they haven't quite yet fallen yet until.
Right. Well, and there's like that wonder in them. They're not so jaded. They haven't seen so much of the world to have that anger. Well, hopefully. And yeah, there's something beautiful of like watching children. Like even my sister's kids, they're Protestant, so they participate differently. But there's something wonderful to see the way that they participate and the way they pick things up. like in church and the way that they pray, there's something kind of beautiful about like the way they radiate that. And I think we lose that as we get older. I think a lot because of the secularness of the Western cultures and the self-consciousness, as you said, Chris, of what other people expect from us and even what we expect from ourselves, probably.
I'm gonna bounce. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Chris. Jess, you stayed way
Okay.
longer than you said.
I know I said like 15, 20 minutes and like, what is it?
Hour and a half.
So much
We-
fun though.
Oh yeah, no, it's been an interesting conversation, and
It touched on all my favorite things and I cried almost. So
so it's the classic Jess bingo card. We got Joe,
Yeah.
we got tears.
yeah, if you're playing at home, you win.
Do you have to go right now, or do you have one more question in you?
No, I have one more.
Okay.
Since
I'm
we've gone
interested-
this far.
We've gone through the tunnel. We'll ask the last question and we'll land the plane.
All right.
So it feels like you've been through an interesting journey and process through your faith and your religion.
Mhm.
Where are you right now with that?
I am in a church. I'm at a Southern Baptist church. It's it's evangelical flavor. I feel called to serve. And really like it's a church that has a strong community to it. It's a newer church, and like a lot of the people are like from the neighborhood, so we see each other like at basketball games and like last night we were at the elementary school because my son was in his 5th grade band, and like everyone's there, plus everyone else from the community. And so like that's what I like about it. I'm not like a giant fan of the doctrine, because it is like a reformed Southern Baptist church, but it's like I don't know. But I don't know about that stuff. Like it's just like I don't care as long as it doesn't become an issue, which it always could be, I guess. But I have good friends, and then so like I'm involved in church, and I always kind of have been. I never like there was never a period in my life where I like left church, but I definitely like went through the whole process internally. And then yeah, but I feel like over the past like 5-6 years, like I've kind of come out of deconstruction valley, so to speak, and like I don't know if I wouldn't say I lost my relationship with God at any point, but it was like literally there was a gap there where I couldn't figure out what was going on, and that's why I like the U-shaped journey stuff, because it's my experience. Like that was a time that helped make me that, and if that's what God is doing, then like he's like serving me, and I find that pretty incredible. And so, and it's one of those things where like God was there all along, and like even it's like that's what is that stupid the what is it, footprints in the sand poem? Do you know that one? It's so cheesy. But it's kind of like and with everything that's been happening on Bridges of Meaning and all this stuff, like I feel like I just see God everywhere. Like he's just everywhere doing everything. And yeah, so yeah, I am a Christian. And
so when you were going through the deconstruction stuff, did you ever say it out loud to people like in the communities you were part of, or was it that silent battle where you just kind of dealt with it yourself?
Like I never said anything about like the atheism thing. Like that was something I thought, but like every other conversation I had with all kinds of people, because I had friends that became atheists, and so I would have these conversations with them about different things. But But it is interesting. Grim was asking about, like, have you always loved God? Because that's kind of been the case, and I couldn't ever like just be like, okay, God doesn't exist, and I don't have a relationship with him anymore. Like it seems like I would have to lie to sort of make that be the case.
Mm.
And so I could never, I never was able to, I never found a reason. And then also plus because I would have to lie about it, then I'm like, well, then it's not, I can't say it. I can't be that. So
Well,
yeah.
there was plenty of reasons presented to me. I couldn't find a good one where I was like, oh, okay, yeah.
Right. There's all these
That's it.
doubts. There was plenty of doubts. There was plenty of like, and like, I got into Marxism for a while and all the typical sort of searching, trying to find like, where's something I can believe in? What can I put my life towards? Justice seemed like a good thing, and like social, like, and that was back in early 2000s. So it was like, I don't know. So it kind of, I'm very postmodern. My dad always jokes around with me about that. He's like, is that postmodern what you're talking about? I'm like, I guess.
Well, interesting. Well, no, I appreciate it. I just find the journey of that fascinating. I think there's so many people, particularly in like the millennial generation and around the edges of those ages where they're going through this thing, where they're like questioning the faith, and it ends in so many different places.
Right.
And the diversity of that is interesting. And I think it, like, by exploring those stories, it has something to teach us about like the fullness of what it is to be human in the world, and like the way to process those things better. So anyways, I just appreciate you being willing to talk about it. I don't mean to be nosy.
No, I love it. Like, I'll just talk about anything. I'm like an open book. I have no secrets.
That's definitely my
except
motive.
for that one thing.
Yeah, we don't talk about that. No, that's my kind of motive being. It's definitely off-putting to some people. I think particularly being in Europe now, people are more
really?
like cards in their chest. I feel
Like
I feel very American sometimes when I'm like, oh yeah, this, that, the other. Okay.
Information.
Pretty much, but it's life. It makes me friends. So
yeah.
All right. Well,
time to
yeah,
land.
I think I'm gonna land the plane. It's been great.
Thank you for having me on.
My life. Oh, of course. Thank you for being here.
Awesome.
I will not be doing this next Friday because I have things I have to do. But maybe Saturday. I'm not promising. And then if not this week, I'll try again next Friday. And then, we'll see how it goes. So if you'd like to be a part of a conversation, look out next Friday. Thanks for watching, guys.